Did you know that the 1940s completely transformed Western cinema from simple good guy versus bad guy stories into something far more complex and authentic? While everyone remembers the big budget classics, there's a hidden treasure trove of lesser known films that revolutionized the genre, and incredibly, they're all available to stream for free right now. Let's discover the hidden gems that forever changed how we see the American West. Billy the Kid Trapped, 1942. The Billy the Kid series of the 1940s represented a fascinating shift in how Hollywood portrayed legendary Western figures. Billy the Kid Trapped, starring Buster Crabbe, exemplifies this evolution by presenting a more nuanced view of the infamous outlaw than earlier films dared to attempt. Set against the backdrop of New Mexico's Lincoln County, the film captures the political tensions and economic struggles that actually drove the historical Billy the Kid to outlawry. Unlike the romanticized portrayals of previous decades, Crabbe's Billy is shown as a product of his harsh environment rather than an inherently evil character. The film accurately depicts the cattle baron conflicts that plagued the territory, showing how young men like Billy were often caught between competing factions with no clear moral high ground. What makes this film particularly noteworthy is its attention to period detail. The costumes, weapons, and set designs reflect extensive research into 1870s frontier life. The dialogue, while simplified for 1940s audiences, incorporates authentic frontier vernacular and avoids the overly polished speech common in earlier westerns. The film's portrayal of Hispanic characters, while not perfect by modern standards, was progressive for its time, acknowledging the multicultural reality of the Southwest frontier. The production values, though modest by today's standards, effectively convey the isolation and danger of frontier life. The cinematography captures the stark beauty of the Western landscape while emphasizing the vulnerability of settlements scattered across vast, unforgiving terrain. Billy the Kid Trapped serves as an excellent introduction to how 1940s filmmakers began incorporating historical authenticity into Western narratives. Cattle Stampede, 1943. Cattle Stampede represents the maturation of the B-Western format, demonstrating how even lower-budget productions of the 1940s elevated their storytelling beyond simple adventure tales. This film, part of the continuing Billy the Kid series, tackles the economic realities of frontier ranching with surprising sophistication. The central conflict revolves around water rights and grazing disputes, issues that were at the heart of many real Western conflicts. Rather than relying on stereotypical villains, the film presents competing interests where both sides have legitimate claims and concerns. Ranchers struggling to maintain their livelihoods face off against farmers seeking to establish permanent settlements, reflecting the genuine tensions that characterized Western expansion. The title sequence, depicting an actual cattle stampede, showcases impressive practical effects work that conveys the genuine danger these events pose to cowboys and settlers alike. Historical accounts describe stampedes as one of the greatest fears of cattle drivers, capable of destroying entire herds and killing experienced cowboys in minutes. The film's depiction, while dramatized, captures the chaos and terror these events inspired. Character development in Cattle Stampede reflects the growing psychological complexity of 1940s westerns. The protagonists face moral dilemmas that cannot be solved through gunfights alone, requiring negotiation, compromise, and personal sacrifice. This evolution in Western storytelling would later influence the genre's greatest masterpieces of the 1950s and beyond. The film's treatment of law enforcement also reflects historical reality, showing peace officers as often overwhelmed, politically influenced figures rather than invincible heroes. This more realistic portrayal helped audiences understand the genuine challenges of maintaining order in rapidly changing frontier communities. Texas Troubleshooters, 1942. Texas Troubleshooters explores the often overlooked role of professional mediators in frontier disputes, based on the historical reality of troubleshooters hired to resolve conflicts between competing interests in the developing West. This film showcases how the 1940s Western began incorporating actual frontier professions and social structures into their narratives. The story follows experienced mediators called in to resolve a range war between established cattlemen and incoming farmers. Rather than taking sides, these troubleshooters must understand the economic and social forces driving the conflict while finding solutions that allow both groups to coexist. This approach reflects actual historical practices, as territorial and state governments often employed neutral parties to prevent violence that could discourage further settlement and economic development. The film's portrayal of frontier economics demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the financial pressures facing Western communities. Drought, market fluctuations, transportation costs, and competition for resources created a volatile environment where reasonable people could find themselves in deadly conflicts. Texas Troubleshooters shows how professional mediators used knowledge of law, economics, and human psychology to diffuse these tensions. Particularly noteworthy is the film's treatment of women's roles in frontier communities. Rather than limiting female characters to traditional romantic interests, the story includes women as property owners, business operators, and community leaders. This reflects the historical reality that frontier women often enjoyed greater economic and social freedom than their Eastern counterparts due to labor shortages and the practical demands of frontier life. The action sequences, while exciting, never overshadow the film's focus on problem-solving and community building. Gunfights occur as last resorts rather than primary solutions, emphasizing the importance of communication and compromise in building sustainable frontier communities. Santa Fe Trail, 1940. Santa Fe Trail, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, represents one of the decade's most ambitious attempts to address the complex political tensions leading up to the Civil War. While taking some dramatic liberties, the film tackles the controversial figure of John Brown and the violent conflicts over slavery in Kansas and Missouri. The film's portrayal of Bleeding Kansas captures the genuine chaos and violence that characterized the territory in the 1850s. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers engaged in guerrilla warfare that foreshadowed the larger conflict to come. Rather than presenting a simple morality tale, the film shows how well-meaning people on both sides were drawn into increasingly violent confrontations that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Flynn's portrayal of J.E.B. Stuart and Ronald Reagan's depiction of George Armstrong Custer present these historical figures as young, idealistic soldiers struggling to maintain order while grappling with the moral implications of their missions. The film accurately depicts the military's difficult position in enforcing federal law while trying to prevent the territory from descending into complete anarchy. The production design effectively recreates 1850s military life, from authentic uniforms and equipment to accurate depictions of frontier army posts. The film's portrayal of cavalry tactics and frontier military operations reflects extensive research into period military practices. Combat sequences emphasize the challenges of fighting irregular forces using conventional military tactics. Most significantly, Santa Fe Trail doesn't shy away from the moral complexities of the slavery issue. While clearly opposing Brown's violent methods, the film acknowledges the justice of anti-slavery sentiments while showing how extremism on both sides contributed to the coming national catastrophe. This nuanced approach was quite sophisticated for 1940 filmmaking. The Rangebusters, 1940. The Rangebusters launched a series that would define the team-based Western format throughout the 1940s. Unlike lone hero narratives, this film presents three protagonists with complementary skills working together to solve frontier problems, reflecting the historical reality that most successful frontier enterprises required cooperation and specialization. The trio consists of a former lawman, an experienced rancher, and a young cowboy, each bringing different perspectives and abilities to their adventures. This structure allows the film to explore various aspects of frontier life through multiple viewpoints. The former lawman understands legal procedures and criminal behavior. The rancher knows cattle operations and land management, while the young cowboy provides energy and represents the next generation of frontier settlers. Their first adventure involves a land-grabbing scheme that threatens to dispossess legitimate homesteaders of their claims. The plot reflects actual historical problems with fraudulent land claims, corrupt officials, and the vulnerable position of individual settlers facing organized criminal enterprises. The Rangebusters must use legal knowledge, fighting skills, and community organizing to defeat opponents who control local law enforcement. The film's treatment of frontier justice emphasizes the importance of evidence and legal procedure even in lawless territories. Rather than relying solely on vigilante action, the protagonists work to restore legitimate legal authority and protect constitutional rights. This approach reflects the historical tension between frontier pragmatism and American legal traditions. Production values emphasize authenticity in depicting frontier ranch operations, from cattle handling techniques to the practical challenges of maintaining livestock in harsh environments. The film's portrayal of frontier communities shows the cooperation required for survival while acknowledging the conflicts that arose from competition for limited resources. Ghost Valley Raiders, 1940. Ghost Valley Raiders explores the supernatural folklore that emerged in isolated frontier communities, while grounding its mystery in the economic and social realities of 1880s Western settlement. The film demonstrates how 1940s Westerns began incorporating Gothic elements while maintaining historical authenticity. The story centers on mysterious disappearances in a remote valley where settlers have reported ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. Rather than relying on actual supernatural forces, the film reveals a rational explanation rooted in the economic pressures facing frontier communities. Hidden criminal operations exploit local superstitions to conceal their activities and discourage investigation. This approach reflects the historical reality that isolated frontier communities often developed elaborate folklore to explain unusual events or dangerous areas. Ghost stories, monster legends, and supernatural beliefs served practical purposes, warning people away from genuinely dangerous locations or providing psychological comfort in harsh, unpredictable environments. The film's portrayal of frontier mining operations accurately depicts the dangerous, often illegal practices that characterized many Western mining ventures. Claim jumping, environmental destruction, and worker exploitation were common problems that law enforcement struggled to address in remote areas. Criminal organizations often used intimidation and violence to control valuable mining sites. Character development emphasizes the psychological challenges of frontier life, particularly the isolation and uncertainty that could lead to mental instability. The film's ghost sightings are revealed to be products of both deliberate deception and genuine psychological stress experienced by settlers struggling to survive in harsh conditions. The resolution emphasizes community cooperation and the importance of distinguishing between legitimate concerns and manufactured fears, themes that resonated with 1940s audiences facing their own uncertainties about global conflict and social change. Billy the Kid's Gun Justice, 1940. Billy the Kid's Gun Justice presents an early example of the psychological Western, exploring the mental toll of violence on both perpetrators and victims. This film moves beyond simple action-adventure to examine how frontier violence affected individuals and communities, reflecting the decade's growing interest in psychological realism. The story follows Billy as he confronts the consequences of his violent reputation, showing how his legend has grown beyond his actual deeds to create expectations and fears that constrain his choices. This theme reflects the historical reality that notorious figures often found themselves trapped by their reputations, unable to escape cycles of violence even when they desired peaceful lives. The film's portrayal of frontier journalism shows how newspapers and dime novels created and embellished Western legends for Eastern audiences, hungry for exciting stories. Sensationalized accounts often bore little resemblance to actual events, but these stories shaped public perceptions and influenced how Western figures were treated by both supporters and opponents. Mental health themes appear throughout the film, particularly in depicting veterans of frontier violence struggling with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Characters exhibit symptoms of anxiety, depression, and emotional numbness that reflect the psychological toll of constant danger and violence. This sophisticated treatment of mental health was unusual for 1940s popular entertainment. The legal system's response to frontier violence receives detailed attention, showing how courts struggled to apply legal standards in situations where traditional law enforcement was absent or ineffective. The film explores concepts of self-defense, justifiable homicide, and the rights of citizens to protect themselves when official protection was unavailable. Community responses to violence form another major theme, as townspeople must decide whether to support or oppose figures like Billy, whose violent skills might protect them, but whose presence also attracts danger and retribution. Blazing Six Shooters, 1940. Blazing Six Shooters focuses on the evolution of frontier law enforcement, following a sheriff who must adapt traditional peacekeeping methods to address new types of crime emerging as Western communities modernized. The film explores how industrialization and improved transportation brought both opportunities and new criminal challenges to frontier towns. The story centers on organized crime networks that exploit improved transportation and communication to operate across multiple jurisdictions. Bank robbers, cattle thieves, and confidence men use railroads and telegraph systems to coordinate activities and evade local law enforcement. This reflects the historical reality that technological progress often benefited criminals before law enforcement adapted to new conditions. Professional development in law enforcement receives detailed treatment, showing how frontier sheriffs had to learn new investigative techniques and legal procedures to address sophisticated criminal enterprises. The film accurately depicts the challenges of gathering evidence, coordinating with other jurisdictions, and applying legal standards in rapidly changing situations. The relationship between local and federal law enforcement forms a major theme, as territorial and federal officials often had different priorities and legal authorities than local peace officers. These jurisdictional conflicts sometimes allowed criminals to escape justice, while honest officials struggled to determine who had authority to pursue various cases. Community support for law enforcement fluctuates throughout the film, reflecting the historical reality that frontier communities sometimes protected popular criminals while opposing unpopular lawmen. Economic interests, personal relationships, and political loyalties could override abstract commitments to law and order when specific cases arose. The film's action sequences emphasize tactical thinking and preparation over simple gunfighting skills, showing how effective law enforcement required intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and community cooperation rather than individual heroics. The Border Legion, 1940. The Border Legion examines cross-border crime and law enforcement cooperation between the United States and Mexico, addressing themes of international relations and cultural understanding that were particularly relevant as World War II approached. The film presents a nuanced view of border communities where national loyalties were complicated by family ties, economic relationships, and shared cultural heritage. The story follows a group of vigilantes pursuing criminals who exploit the international border to evade justice. Rather than presenting simple patriotic themes, the film shows how border enforcement requires understanding of Mexican law, customs, and political conditions. Successful cooperation depends on mutual respect and recognition of legitimate interests on both sides of the border. Cultural themes receive sophisticated treatment, particularly in depicting Mexican characters as complex individuals with their own motivations and concerns, rather than stereotypical villains or noble savages. The film shows how language barriers, religious differences, and divergent legal traditions could create misunderstandings while also enriching border communities through cultural exchange. Economic relationships across the border include both legitimate trade and criminal enterprises, reflecting the historical reality that border regions often developed integrated economies that ignored political boundaries. Cattle ranching, mining, and agricultural operations frequently involved cooperation between Mexican and American entrepreneurs who shared practical interests despite national differences. The role of religion in frontier communities receives attention through the film's portrayal of Catholic missions and Protestant churches as sources of both cooperation and conflict. Religious institutions often provided the only education, medical care, and social services available in remote areas, while theological differences sometimes created community tensions. Military themes include accurate depictions of cavalry operations along the border and the challenges of preventing international incidents while pursuing legitimate law enforcement objectives. Carson City Kid, 1940. Carson City Kid explores the boom and bust cycle of mining towns, following the rapid growth and decline of communities built around mineral extraction. The film accurately depicts how mining discoveries could transform remote areas overnight while creating social and environmental problems that outlasted the economic benefits. Roy Rogers stars as a young man who arrives in Carson City during the height of silver mining prosperity, witnessing both the opportunities and dangers created by rapid population growth and economic speculation. The film shows how mining booms attracted not only honest workers and entrepreneurs, but also gamblers, criminals, and opportunists seeking quick profits through any available means. Social stratification in mining communities receives detailed attention, showing how economic success created distinct social classes with different interests and loyalties. Mine owners, skilled workers, day laborers, and service providers often found themselves in conflict over wages, working conditions, and political control. These tensions were complicated by ethnic and regional differences among workers drawn from around the world. Environmental destruction appears as a significant theme, with accurate depictions of how mining operations polluted water supplies, destroyed agricultural land, and created public health hazards. The film shows how short-term economic gains often came at the expense of long-term community sustainability, a theme that resonated with Depression-era audiences familiar with economic boom and bust cycles. The role of women in mining communities extends beyond traditional romantic interests to include business owners, property managers, and community leaders who often provided stability and continuity as male populations fluctuated with economic conditions. These women faced unique challenges in male-dominated environments, while often enjoying greater economic independence than women in established Eastern communities. Covered Wagon Days, 1940. Covered Wagon Days chronicles the organization and execution of a wagon train journey, providing detailed depictions of the practical challenges and social dynamics that characterized overland migration to the Western Territories. The film serves as an excellent primer on frontier transportation technology and the community cooperation required for successful long-distance travel. The story follows the three Musketeers as they guide a group of settlers through the multiple stages of wagon train organization, from initial planning through arrival at their destination. Each phase presents different challenges requiring specific knowledge and skills, from equipment selection and route planning to conflict resolution and emergency medical care. Technical aspects of wagon train travel receive accurate treatment, including depictions of wagon construction, animal care, and supply management. The film shows how successful expeditions required careful calculation of food, water, and equipment needs while maintaining enough flexibility to adapt to unexpected challenges, like weather delays, broken equipment, or route changes. Social organization within wagon trains reflected democratic principles while requiring strong leadership to resolve disputes and coordinate group activities. The film accurately portrays how these temporary communities developed their own rules and customs while maintaining connections to legal and social institutions they had left behind. The relationship between wagon trains and Native American communities appears as a complex mix of trade, conflict, and mutual assistance. Rather than presenting simple hostility, the film shows how successful expeditions often depended on information and assistance from indigenous peoples familiar with local conditions and resources. Environmental challenges include accurate depictions of river crossings, mountain passes, and desert travel that tested both human endurance and technological capabilities. The film emphasizes how natural obstacles required careful planning and community cooperation to overcome safely. The Durango Kid, 1940. The Durango Kid introduces Charles Starrett's most famous character in a film that examines the psychology of dual identity and the social pressures that drive ordinary citizens to become masked vigilantes. This origin story explores themes of justice, community responsibility, and the costs of maintaining secret identities that would influence superhero narratives for decades. The story establishes Steve Brannon as a mild-mannered businessman who adopts the Durango Kid identity to fight corruption that official law enforcement cannot address. This dual identity allows the film to explore different approaches to frontier justice while examining the personal costs of leading a double life. The psychological strain of maintaining two personas reflects real-world challenges faced by undercover law enforcement officers and intelligence agents. Community corruption forms the central conflict, as local officials and business leaders exploit their positions for personal gain, while ordinary citizens feel powerless to seek justice through normal channels. The film accurately depicts how political corruption could flourish in frontier communities where formal oversight was limited and economic opportunities created strong incentives for abuse of power. The masked vigilante tradition in Western folklore receives respectful treatment, acknowledging both the appeal and dangers of extra-legal justice. While supporting the Durango Kid's efforts to protect innocent people, the film also shows how vigilante action can undermine legitimate authority and create cycles of violence that are difficult to control. Social class tensions appear throughout the story as wealthy and powerful individuals use their positions to exploit working-class community members who lack resources to defend themselves through legal channels. These themes resonated with Depression-era audiences familiar with economic inequality and corruption. The film's action sequences emphasize strategic thinking and preparation over simple gunfighting, showing how the Durango Kid's effectiveness depends on intelligence gathering, careful planning, and understanding of criminal psychology rather than superior marksmanship alone. Hidden Gold, 1940. Hidden Gold combines treasure hunting adventure with realistic depictions of frontier mining operations and the geological knowledge required for successful mineral extraction. The film follows Hopalong Cassidy as he investigates mysterious disappearances connected to a supposedly abandoned gold mine, revealing active mining operations hidden from public knowledge. The story explores the technical aspects of gold mining, from prospecting techniques and ore processing to the engineering challenges of underground operations. These depictions reflect extensive research into actual mining practices and provide educational value alongside entertainment. The film shows how successful mining required understanding of geology, engineering, and chemistry rather than simple luck or determination. Economic themes include the relationship between mining discoveries and land speculation, as knowledge of mineral deposits could dramatically increase property values while creating opportunities for fraud and manipulation. The film accurately depicts how information about mining prospects was often closely guarded and sometimes deliberately spread to influence land sales and investment decisions. Environmental consequences of mining operations receive attention through depictions of water pollution, landscape destruction, and health hazards created by chemical processing techniques. These concerns were particularly relevant to 1940s audiences dealing with industrial pollution and workplace safety issues in their own communities. Labor relations in mining operations include accurate portrayals of dangerous working conditions, inadequate safety measures, and conflicts between owners and workers over wages and working conditions. The film shows how remote mining locations often operated outside normal legal oversight, creating opportunities for exploitation and abuse. The mystery elements involve sophisticated criminal enterprises that exploit the complexity of mining law and the difficulties of monitoring remote operations. These themes reflect real historical problems with claim jumping, fraudulent surveys, and corruption in territorial land offices. Law and Order, 1940. Law and Order examines the establishment of formal legal institutions in frontier communities, following a town's transition from informal, vigilante justice to constitutional law enforcement. The film provides detailed depictions of how legal systems developed in Western territories while addressing the tensions between frontier pragmatism and constitutional principles. The story centers on conflicts between old-style frontier justice and formal legal procedures as a growing town establishes courts, jails, and professional law enforcement. These tensions reflect historical realities as Western communities struggle to balance the need for effective law enforcement with respect for constitutional rights and due process requirements. Legal education appears as a significant theme, as characters must learn the difference between traditional frontier customs and formal legal requirements. The film accurately depicts how many frontier peace officers lacked formal legal training while facing complex situations requiring knowledge of constitutional law, criminal procedure, and evidence requirements. Political development receives attention through depictions of how communities established local governments and elected officials while maintaining connections to territorial and federal authority. The film shows how political conflicts could complicate law enforcement efforts when different factions supported different approaches to maintaining order. Economic factors in law enforcement include accurate portrayals of funding challenges, equipment shortages, and salary issues that affected the quality and availability of professional peace officers. The film demonstrates how communities had to balance the costs of formal law enforcement against the economic benefits of maintaining order and attracting legitimate business investment. The role of attorneys and judges in frontier communities extends beyond courtroom proceedings to include informal mediation, legal education, and community leadership. These professionals often served as bridges between frontier customs and formal legal traditions while helping communities adapt to changing legal requirements. Prairie Schooners, 1940. Prairie Schooners focuses on the technological innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that drove Western transportation development, following operators of freight wagon services as they adapt to competition from railroad expansion. The film accurately depicts the business challenges and technological evolution that characterized frontier transportation. The story examines the economics of freight hauling, showing how transportation costs affected the viability of frontier communities and businesses. Detailed depictions of wagon construction, route selection, and operational management provide insight into the complex logistics required for successful freight operations across vast distances and challenging terrain. Technological competition between wagon freight and railroad transportation reflects the historical reality of how transportation improvements could rapidly transform economic relationships and community development patterns. The film shows how established businesses had to adapt or disappear as new technologies changed competitive conditions. Labor relations in transportation operations include accurate portrayals of the specialized skills required for successful wagon freight operations, from animal care and equipment maintenance to navigation and weather prediction. The film demonstrates how these skills commanded respect and good wages while requiring constant adaptation to changing conditions. International trade themes appear through depictions of freight operations that cross national boundaries, requiring knowledge of customs regulations, currency exchange, and diplomatic relationships. These operations often served as informal diplomatic contacts between communities separated by political boundaries but connected by economic interests. Environmental adaptation receives attention through accurate depictions of how transportation operations had to adjust to seasonal weather patterns, water availability, and natural obstacles. The film shows how successful operators develop detailed knowledge of local conditions while maintaining flexibility to adapt to unexpected challenges. Ragtime Cowboy Joe, 1940. Ragtime Cowboy Joe explores the cultural fusion that characterized frontier communities as diverse populations brought different musical traditions that blended into distinctive Western musical styles. The film demonstrates how entertainment and cultural expression helped create community identity while bridging cultural differences. The story follows a musician who travels between frontier towns, observing how different communities develop their own musical traditions while sharing songs and styles through traveling performers. This narrative structure allows the film to showcase various musical traditions while depicting the social functions of music in frontier communities. Cultural exchange appears as a central theme, showing how African American, Hispanic, European, and Anglo musical traditions combined to create new forms of expression that reflected the multicultural reality of frontier life. The film accurately depicts how this cultural mixing occurred through informal social interactions rather than formal institutional programs. Economic aspects of frontier entertainment include depictions of how musicians and other performers made livings in communities with limited cash economies and seasonal employment patterns. The film shows how entertainment often operated through barter systems and informal arrangements while providing important social services beyond simple amusement. Social integration through music receives attention as the film demonstrates how shared musical experiences helped create community bonds across ethnic and cultural divisions. These themes were particularly relevant to 1940s audiences dealing with their own challenges of social integration and cultural change. The relationship between popular entertainment and traditional culture appears throughout the film, showing how frontier communities adapted familiar cultural forms to new circumstances while creating innovations that reflected their unique experiences and challenges. Riders of Pasco Basin, 1940. Riders of Pasco Basin examines environmental conservation and sustainable resource management in frontier ranching operations, themes that were gaining prominence as the Dust Bowl and other environmental disasters highlighted the consequences of poor land management practices. The story follows ranchers attempting to maintain sustainable grazing operations while facing pressure from competitors who use environmentally destructive practices to maximize short-term profits. This conflict reflects historical tensions between sustainable and exploitative approaches to natural resource management that continue to influence Western land use policies. Scientific land management receives detailed treatment through depictions of rangeland assessment, water conservation, and sustainable grazing practices based on understanding of local ecosystems and climate patterns. The film demonstrates how successful ranching required knowledge of botany, geology, and wildlife biology rather than simple animal husbandry skills. Economic sustainability themes connect environmental conservation with long-term business success, showing how short-term exploitation often led to economic failure when natural resources became degraded or depleted. These lessons were particularly relevant to Depression-era audiences dealing with the consequences of unsustainable economic practices. Community cooperation in resource management appears as both ranchers and farmers recognize their shared interest in maintaining environmental conditions that support both agricultural and livestock operations. The film accurately depicts how successful resource management often required coordination across property boundaries and competing interests. Technological innovation in conservation includes depictions of improved fencing, water management systems, and grazing rotation practices that allowed more intensive land use while maintaining ecological sustainability. These innovations required both technical knowledge and financial investment that was often beyond the reach of individual operators. Thundering Frontier, 1940. Thundering Frontier concludes our journey through 1940s Western cinema with an examination of how frontier communities prepared for and adapted to the approaching modern era. The film explores themes of technological change, generational conflict, and cultural preservation that resonated strongly with audiences facing their own period of rapid social transformation. The story follows a frontier town as it grapples with the arrival of modern technology and business practices that threaten traditional ways of life while offering new opportunities for economic development. This conflict reflects the historical reality of how Western communities experienced modernization as both liberation from frontier hardships and loss of valued cultural traditions. Generational themes appear throughout the film as older residents who experienced frontier development firsthand clash with younger people, more comfortable with modern technology and social arrangements. These conflicts often centered on questions of progress versus tradition, individual opportunity versus community solidarity, and adaptation versus preservation of established practices. Educational development receives attention through depictions of how frontier communities establish schools and libraries while debating curriculum content and educational philosophy. The film shows how these institutions served as bridges between frontier experience and modern knowledge while sometimes creating conflicts over cultural values and priorities. Economic modernization includes accurate portrayals of how improved transportation and communication connected frontier communities with national markets while subjecting them to economic forces beyond local control. These changes brought both opportunities and vulnerabilities that required new forms of community organization and individual adaptation. The film's conclusion emphasizes continuity within change, showing how frontier values and experiences could be preserved and adapted, rather than simply abandoned as communities modernized. This message of selective adaptation, rather than wholesale rejection of the past, provided comfort to audiences facing their own uncertainties about rapid social change. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through the transformative westerns of the 1940s. Films that didn't just entertain, but laid the groundwork for decades of cinematic innovation to follow. If you're fascinated by film history, or just love a good western, please hit that like button and share this video with fellow movie enthusiasts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into forgotten classics and the stories behind the films that shaped American cinema. Drop a comment letting us know which of these 19 westerns you're most excited to watch, or if you've seen any of them already. Until next time, happy trails and happy streaming.